So you've made a sourdough starter, or maybe you're in the process of making a sourdough starter and you're wondering exactly what does feeding your sourdough starter look like. Maybe the process is a little bit confusing to you. Well, in this video, I'm going to cover everything from why you should feed your sourdough starter to how and how often you should feed your sourdough starter. And I'm also going to highlight some common mistakes that a lot of bakers make at the end, so stay tuned for that. I want to highlight why exactly we should be feeding our sourdough starters, because I think understanding this concept is really going to help you to make sure that you're staying on top of a feeding schedule and understand exactly how you should be doing so that you can mitigate some of the problems that are possible to experience, which I'll talk about at the end. Sourdough starter, it is a combination of wild yeast and bacteria that develop over time. We want to make sure that the wild yeast and bacteria that are being naturally developed in your sourdough starter are staying as healthy as possible. The reason being is because this is what's going to lead to leavening your bread properly and beautifully. And also this is directly correlated to that unique and delicious sourdough flavor that you're going to experience in your bread. So making sure we understand why we're feeding our sourdough starter in the first place is going to be fundamental. So let's shift over to how to feed your sourdough starter and when to feed your sourdough starter. Now, of course, if you search the internet, you're going to get many different mixed opinions or ways on how to do it. And that's fine, because really the truth is there's no one way to do it. But just to keep it simple, I'm just going to show you how I feed my sourdough, and some of the mistakes that I've made, I've been able to overcome by kind of switching up my technique and doing some research as well. So I have my sourdough starter here. I fed it a few days ago, and then I made a couple of loaves of bread with that. So it hasn't been fed in a couple of days. Ideally, you want to be feeding your starter once per week at minimum. So when we go ahead and feed our starter, for example, I'm going to feed mine because I want to make bread within the next day or two. And just a little hack, you don't necessarily have to feed your starter, wait for it to peak, which means double in size or in volume, and get all those nice bubbles on it to bake with it right away. You can actually leave your starter in the fridge, I found, for up to 48 hours. And as long as there's still a strong foamy presence of bubbles on the top, then it should be okay to bake with still. Now, you might not get the lofty loaf that you would have gotten if you would have made that loaf of bread right away when it peaked, but you can still use it fresh out of the fridge within 48 hours is what I found. I'll link some recipes from my blog down below. Right now, I'm just making a sourdough discard granola, which is one of my favorites. So that calls for 1/3 cup of sourdough discard. So I'm just going to pour that discard right in here. And that was about half of my sourdough starter. I already added all the rest of the ingredients into the bowl, so the sourdough starter was all that I had left to add. So I recommend, before feeding your starter, say it's been a week since you fed it, take it out of the fridge, make some sourdough pancakes, biscuits, cookies, really any recipe that utilizes sourdough discard. That way you're freshening your starter with more fresh flour and more fresh water, and it's not competing with that sourdough starter that's already in there. And like I said, this is just going to make sure that the yeast and bacteria stays balanced. Okay, so now that you know what to do with your sourdough starter before feeding it again, let's move on to how you should feed your starter. So now that I just got rid of about half of my discard, I know that I want to make bread within the next day or two, probably tomorrow. I'm not going to get to it tonight because it's already like almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but I am going to feed it. And then, like I said, I'll stick it in the fridge overnight, and it'll still be just as good to bake with tomorrow morning. So I'm going to do what's called 100% hydration starter. So what that simply means is I'm going to use equal parts of flour and water to feed my sourdough starter. So I like to use a combination of flours. So you can use whatever flour you have on hand or whatever you like best, but I like to do like half bread flour, half rye flour. So I have some stone ground dark rye flour here and some bread flour. I'm just going to measure out about half with bread flour, and then I'm just going to top the rest off with our dark rye flour. I like using a mixture of flour. Not only does it add to the flavor complexity, but it also adds to the wild yeast, bacteria, and organisms. It makes it more complex when you add a whole grain instead of just a white flour. you'll have a lot more nutrition present within your sourdough starter. And I think one of the main reasons why most people want to get into making sourdough starter and sourdough bread is because it's so much more nutritious than say just a loaf of bread leavened from traditional yeast. So I have my 1/2 cup of flour measured out. I'm just going to go ahead and use this funnel so that I don't make a mess. So depending on how much you like to bake is really going to gauge how much you feed your starter. So I'm going with 1/2 cup of flour and 1/2 cup of water because I'll probably end up making some sourdough pancakes or something like that, something that's going to require sourdough discard before I feed it again the next time I make bread. So just gauge it based off your baking schedule. So if you don't bake as often, maybe just feed it 1/4 cup of flour and 1/4 cup of water. So that'll make less sourdough starter. Now, if you plan on making multiple loaves of bread, maybe you'll want to do 1 cup and 1 cup. It really just depends. Okay, so we got our 1/2 cup of flour, and then I've already pre-measured out 1/2 cup of filtered water. So I'm just gonna pour that right in. Just gonna use a butter knife here to stir it, just because my jar is rather long. And what 100% hydration means simply is just that, as it sounds, it just has more water in it. So if you were gonna do a 50% hydrated starter, you would use 1/2 cup of flour and 1/4 cup of water, and that would make it 50% hydrated. So the biggest thing, as you get the hang of making sourdough bread, and maybe looking up different recipes, try not to get too, I guess, caught off guard or confused by 100% hydration or 75% hydration, because after you start making your loaves of bread, you'll kind of start to be able to gauge like the consistency that you're going for with each loaf of bread. And eventually you can even get to the point where you don't have to measure anything. So wouldn't that be nice? That would add confidence in the kitchen, that would save time, and just make it a lot more simple and enjoyable. That is it. I fed my sourdough starter. Now I'm just gonna wait until this peaks, or in other words, until this doubles in volume, and when it has lots of nice thick bubbles on the top and on the sides, we'll know it's ready to either bake with, if that's what you decide to do, or go into the fridge. I also have a complete how to make a sourdough starter guide on my blog, and I can link that for you guys down below if you'd like to check it out. It definitely is going to go into a lot more detail than I'm giving in this video, and for those that are readers, I think that'll be a really great way to learn as well. So common mistakes when feeding a sourdough starter include overfeeding your starter or underfeeding your starter. Kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier. So one of the mistakes that I ran into was having an abundance of starter that I wasn't using and just continuing to feed the starter. Just honestly, I would just put a few spoonfuls of flour in there and just a little bit of water. I wasn't measuring anything, which, not saying you have to measure per se, but it does help to kind of gauge how much you're putting back into your starter, because you want to make sure that the yeast and bacteria stay as healthy as possible so that you can make delicious, consistent loaves of bread. And you also want to make sure that it doesn't become overly acidic, which is what happened to my starter. And I thought I was going to have to start over from scratch. But one thing that I did was I was feeding my starter. I just saved a little bit of the starter. I transferred it to a new jar. I fed it a lot of flour and water, and I had to do that a couple of times to kind of get it rebalanced again. And so in order to mitigate that, you'll just have to make sure that you just follow the prompts that I gave you. That also coincides with, you don't want to overfeed your starter either, because if you're overfeeding it, then you're going to make an abundance of starter that you probably aren't going to be using in a timely manner, and that can just throw the yeast and bacteria out of whack as well. So we want to be really cognizant of, do I bake a lot? Am I going to be baking a lot this week or this day? How much starter do I need? 1/4 cup for this recipe, 1/4 cup for that recipe, and as time goes on, you'll just kind of be able to get a hang of it. So the third most common mistake that a lot of bakers tend to make is using tap water for their sourdough starter. Now, there's many reasons why you shouldn't do this, but probably some of the most obvious are going to be because all of the contaminants that are normally found in tap water. So heavy metals, there's so many toxins that are found in unfiltered water that we really just want to avoid putting into our starter at all costs. It can hinder the yeast and bacteria growth. It can just hinder the overall health of our sourdough starter. That's a big no-no. So we definitely want to stick with either filtered water or distilled water for our sourdough starter. All right, you guys, well, I'm gonna get this sourdough granola onto my baking sheet. And that concludes this video. I hope that this video was helpful and insightful to you guys. If it was, please like and comment down below. I would also love it if you guys considered subscribing as well. I'm gonna continue to post content around all things health, fitness, biblical homemaking, time-saving kitchen strategies, and things of that nature. So if that stuff interests you guys, like I said earlier, just hit that subscribe button so that you guys won't miss an upload from me. I'm gonna link this video right up top that you guys can check out, and this is just a visual guide of the step-by-step, day-by-day process of what it looks like to create a sourdough starter. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching this video, and I will see you guys on the next one.